All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Online Lecture 10. This is Collecting, Defining, and Sampling, Day 1. Okay, so basically, Day 1 is going to really focus on collecting data and different ways that we accomplish this. I'll go through some different ways. I'll go through their advantages and disadvantages briefly. I'll give you a couple of highlights and let you continue to read about the different advantages and disadvantages. All right. So let's start off with tests, okay? Tests are commonly used to measure personality, aptitude, achievement, and performance. They're often standardized with information on reliability, validity, and norms. So I know we haven't really talked about reliability and validity yet, but in short, reliability has to do with how repeatable an item is, okay? So if you gave the same test to the same person, um, how similar would the scores be? Validity has to do with how accurate an item is, okay? And norms has to do with basically how it compares to a normal population, okay? So you could, if a person takes a SAT test, then there are norms that show how their score falls percentage-wise compared to other students who might have taken the same SAT. Okay. So what are some of the strengths of tests? Well, they can provide measures of many characteristics of people. It allows comparability of common measures across research populations, right? So IQ tests are a great example of this, where you can look at how comparable people are, even if you're looking at different populations. They're often standardized and have strong psychometric properties, which we talked about. They can be administered to groups in many cases, and they tend to be very quantitative, um, and that makes them easy to analyze data-wise. Okay. They can be expensive. So if you would like a career in psychology where you make a fair amount of money, get very good at creating tests. Because if you wind up with a popular test, they sell for a fair amount of money, and you'd be in some good shape there. Reactivity of participants, such as social desirability, that can happen. Social desirability will be a problem for many of these methods of data collection. The test might not be appropriate for a local or unique population. That's true if we don't have norms, or if it just doesn't work, right? Certain tests might not be good if we're looking for people who cannot read, right? A standard IQ test won't work there. Open-ended questions and probing are typically not available for tests. They might be biased against certain groups of people. And what happens if people decide not to respond to certain items on a test? It can really make it difficult to score that. And then, of course, some tests do lack that nice reliability, validity, and norms data. Okay. Questionnaires. This is a self-report data collection instrument that is filled out by research participants. It often assesses opinions, perceptions, and demographic information. They're good for measuring attitudes, eliciting content, opinions, all those sort of things. They tend to be inexpensive. You can learn about perspectives, ways of thinking, and you can get a nice quick turnaround if you do a group administration. Sometimes you can actually set up questionnaires in a way that your participants can feel very anonymous, and that can be really helpful in terms of getting both truthful and useful responses. If you have a well-validated measure, then that would be great, right? You could actually have measures here that are validated. Closed-ended items can provide exact information. And open-ended items can provide detailed information in respondent's own words. So when we're talking about a closed-ended item, we typically mean like a multiple choice or something, or uh, choose more than one item or choose just one item. Open-ended tend to be more fill in the blank or even comments, longer open-ended questions. Okay. But usually questionnaires typically have to be kept short if you're going to keep your respondents' attention. We have social desirability problems again, right? Your participant might try to answer in ways that they believe that is socially desirable, particularly ways that they think the researcher wants. Again, we can have non-response issues to select items. And people filling out questionnaires when they're about opinions and attitudes, they might not report important information that they don't remember or that they're not aware of. If you do mail or email or those kind of questionnaires, that way you can get really low response rates. It's really hard to get people to respond. People tend to be a little overwhelmed these days with research requests. Open-ended items may reflect differences in verbal ability, obscuring the issues of interest, right? So if you leave an item open, it's just people may not be able to express themselves as well as other people can. And so then it's hard to know what you're really getting. Okay. And data analysis can be a challenge for those open-ended questions. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about interviews. Okay. This is a situation where the interviewer asks the interviewee a set of questions. This can be face-to-face, telephone, electronically, internet, whatever you like. So some interviews can be highly structured. Some interviews will be far less so. One of my favorite interviews is called the Structured Clinical Interview for Diagnosis, or SCID. And this was created some years back by Michael First. And it lets you go through all the different diagnoses, or at least a lot of the different diagnoses in the DSM, and be able to figure out if people are meeting criteria or not. So you might, for example, start off by asking a couple of questions about depressive symptoms. And if the person doesn't answer to the positive, they don't affirm these depressive symptoms, then you don't have to continue on asking about depressive symptoms because you know they're not going to meet criteria. But if they do answer to the positive, then you would continue on. And then you'd go on to the next possible diagnosis. So it's kind of a clever way of doing an interview. But let's talk about some strengths. It's good for measuring attitudes and most other content of interest. You can have follow-up questions. You can have people provide in-depth information, and you can provide information about participants' perspective and ways of thinking. Now, bear in mind, this is typical interviews where you're just asking these open-ended questions and looking for an answer. If you focus it a bit more, like I said with the SCID, then you don't get some of this stuff as much, but then you get better psychometrics, better reliability, better validity, those sort of things. Okay. So close-ended questions, close-ended interviews like the SCID provide exact information. Telephone and email interviews usually provide nice quick turnaround. You can have some high measurement validity for well-constructed and well-tested interview protocols. And you typically get relatively high response rates, or you can at least. It kind of depends how you do it, but usually once a person walks in for your interview, they're not going to walk away and leave. Whereas with a questionnaire, with a test, they're sitting there, especially in a group, they might feel that they want to skip certain questions or get done really quickly, and then you have more of those issues. With an interview, they're kind of stuck with you, or they might feel a little stuck with you, so they might stick around a little bit longer and go ahead and answer your questions. Okay. In-person interviews are usually expensive and time-consuming, right? We still have social desirability effects, and they might even be worse on an interview because you're right there in person with someone else, or right over the phone with someone else, or those sort of things. You can also have investigator effects. Now that's a new one, right? The investigator is now part of this interview process, and that might influence things. Same issue about interviewing is not recalling certain information, lacking self-awareness about certain issues, so they might not respond as accurately as you might hope. In this case, respondents might not feel so anonymous, right? They're sitting right there with you or talking right there with you, whereas in a questionnaire in a room full of people, they might feel like they kind of are just sinking into the crowd and could be anonymous if you don't ask for names and such, but in an interview, less so. And if you have open-ended questions, data analysis can be really challenging and time-consuming. And once again, we'd like our measures to have validation. Not all of them do. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about focus groups. Focus groups are a situation where a focus group moderator keeps a small and similar structured group focused on the discussion of a research topic or issue. So in other words, the group typically has something in common. Okay, usually it's 6 to 12 people. The focus group generally lasts from 1 to 3 hours. It's recorded using some fashion or other. Could just be audio, could be video as well. And it's not a group interview. You're focusing on interaction between people. So an example here might be if you were looking at high schoolers, high school students, and wondering how they deal with stress. So it's a relatively homogeneous group, right? Because we're talking about high schoolers, and we're looking at people at how they deal with stress. We might even make it more confined and look at high schoolers who work outside of school. To actually have either part-time or full-time jobs outside of school. Okay. What are some of the strengths? Well, as you might probably already be guessing, it's very much allows you to explore ideas, to get really in the window of how people are thinking. You can attain lots of in-depth information. You uniquely in this one get how participants react to each other. Right? You can probe, you can follow up when they say something, and you are able to get at most content. Now these can be expensive. That's one of the weaknesses. It can be difficult to find a focus group moderator with good rapport building skills. Right? You need someone who's particularly talented at getting people to really talk to each other. Okay, so now we're not just worried about reactions by the participants for social desirability, but there can be investigator effects as well. Also, you run into the problem of what if there's just 1 or 2 people who dominate the conversation, right? Okay. This one, one of the biggest challenges is that it's really difficult to generalize results. If you just chose a small unrepresentative sample, you're not going to be able to really talk about how this generalizes to the population. Okay, and you might get a whole bunch of extra information. And it's going to be really difficult to data analyze as well. Okay. And your measurement validity might be quite low because, this is just a focus group. You just had open-ended questions for the most part, most likely. So, yeah, you're going to have a struggle there. All right. Next one I want to talk to you about is observation. Now, there's different kinds of observation that are potentially completed, so I want to talk to you about some of those. First, we can have naturalistic observation. This is done in real-world settings. Maybe a playground and you're looking at kids playing on a playground, whereas a laboratory setting is done in a lab or other controlled environment. All right. You also can do sampling in observation. It may not be realistic for you to sit on the playground and observe for 3 hours straight. So maybe instead you observe during pre-selected time intervals, like the first 5 minutes of every 30-minute time interval. Right? So you would observe from 9 to 9:05, then 9:30 to 9:35, then 10 to 10:05, etc., etc. And event sampling, maybe you only sample every time that a particular event takes place. Maybe you're only going to look anytime you see some type of aggressive behavior. Maybe then that's when you're going to sample. Okay. Now, when we're talking about observation, we're typically talking about qualitative research. The observation tends to be very exploratory, open-ended, and the researcher takes extensive field notes. Okay. So, how far away does the observer stay from the situation? That's another important piece to kind of figure out, and there's lots of choices. You can have the complete observer, where the researcher observes from the outside, and they may not even inform the participants that they're studying them. Okay. The observer could also be a participant, where they spend a limited amount of time inside the situation. And the observer must obtain informed consent to observe participants for this research study of this kind. Or the researcher might spend extensive time, not excessive, extensive time inside the group or situation. And then you also have to obtain informed consent. Okay. Or the researcher becomes a full participating member of the group and the group must be informed and permission granted. Okay, so the researcher can stay all the way back, just maybe kind of hanging out on a bench away from the playground, not even letting the kids know that the researcher's observing them, and note every time that there is some kind of an aggressive behavior, and then maybe note the kind of aggression that is demonstrated. Or they can be right on the playground as a complete participant, playing along with the kiddos and observing directly how conflicts are resolved, or observing directly how aggressive behavior is formed. Okay. So when we're talking about observation, what you want to do is make sure everyone is well trained in observation. That's really important. You want to be sensitive about your appearance because people being observed will react to you. Okay, this is again, most likely if you're inside the situation, not just completely outside. You can establish rapport, but don't promise anything you can't deliver. You want to be as unobtrusive, empathetic, and alert at all times as possible. Find an effective way to record what's being observed. Try to validate and corroborate what you think you are seeing. That's a tough one, especially if you're just from the outside. Make observations in multiple settings, right? So don't just go to one playground, go to several. And spend enough time in the field to obtain sufficient information. Okay. So I know that there's one lab on campus that actually does interesting observations of gorillas in the local zoo, and has been doing this research for years to understand different patterns of behavior there. And of course, in this case, they're standing back and observing, not really interacting with the animals. But it's really interesting research. Okay. So what are some of the strengths of observation? Well, first, it allows one to directly see what people do, provides that first-hand experience. And you can be somewhat objective about it, right? If you really try and come up with a good rubric, you can be objective about it. The observer can also determine what does not occur. The observer might see things that escape the awareness of people in the setting. And it's an excellent way to discover what is occurring in a setting. And it can help in understanding the importance of outside factors, of what's going on in the context of everything. It can be used with participants with weak verbal skills. It might provide information on things people would otherwise be unwilling to talk about. The observer might move beyond selective perceptions of participants in the setting. It can be good for description, and it provides a moderate degree of realism when done outside of the laboratory. So you get something we'll talk about later, which is called external validity, which basically means that, we're likely to potentially have some good generalization if we have done our job right in terms of the way we've done our observation. The reasons for observed behavior might be unclear. That's a weakness, right? Because we're not sure why they just acted aggressively necessarily. The reactivity might occur when respondents know they're being observed, right? So all those cases except when you're the complete outsider, the respondents might react, might treat you differently. And we can also have investigator effects. If you're the investigator or researcher and you become involved in the play at the playground, maybe you find yourself liking or feeling an affinity more to some kids than others. Now here's another one. The observer might go native, which basically means that the observer becomes too involved in the situation. You might be limited in how many different people or settings that you can observe. And you can't really get at large or dispersed populations this way. Certain things cannot be observed, right? There are certain behaviors, certain settings that are more private and difficult to actually get data on. You're probably going to get a lot of extra data, things that may be unimportant in the long run. This is a more expensive measure, and the data analysis can be really time consuming because again, you could get some quantitative data here, but it's going to be a bit of a challenge to really analyze that, especially if what you're getting is less countable and less numeric. Okay. Existing or secondary data. Data that were originally left behind or used for some purpose other than the new research study. Okay. Most frequently used data are documents, like physical data, and archive research data. So what's archive research data? It's secondary research data that were collected by other researchers for other purposes. I love secondary data, existing data. I think it's a great way to do research. Oftentimes researchers collect way more data than they actually need, and there's a whole host of reasons why they do that and why that may be justified. But you don't want data to go to waste. So why not use some of that data and look at other issues that are of interest? I'll give you an example. Some years back, I used an annual data set that was conducted, and it's done on health and safety issues and those sort of things. And it's a really long questionnaire and asks a lot of good questions. And using just a few questions from that data set, we were able to do some research about the stigma of seeking mental health assistance or mental health services. So that was really interesting. Yeah, so you can do a lot with archived research data. So let's look at some of the strengths of documents and physical data, as well as some of the strengths of archived research data. Documents and physical data. So what are we talking about here? You might look at collected medical notes, right? Or collected notes from even psychological settings. And this can be unobtrusive. It can be collected for time periods occurring in the past, provides background and historical data, can be used for corroboration of ideas, and it's useful for exploration. Okay, so that has some strengths. I think that this comes up a little bit more with medical research, in particular, the documents and physical data. So looking at health records, let's say over time, and you could look at history of smoking, and then you could look at different medical outcomes and see if there's an association between those. Okay, if you have doctor's records over a period of time for a particular set of patients. Now, archived research data is nice in that it's available on a wide variety of topics. It's inexpensive. They're often reliable and valid. And you can study trends. There's ease of data analysis, and it's often based on high quality or large probability samples. So often these data sets that are made available are from really large, well-funded, well-done studies. Okay, all right. Now let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Weaknesses of documents and physical data, well, they might be incomplete and might only represent one perspective. Also, getting access can be a problem. It's not necessarily easy to get access to, let's say, medical records. And it might not provide insight into participants' personal thinking or anything like that. It's just sort of the facts that are lying there. And it might not apply to general populations. Okay. Now, let's talk about some of the weaknesses of archived research data. Might not be available for what you're interested in. That's the biggest one, right? It might not be available for your population of interest or for your research questions. The data might be dated. The data might be old, right? They might not have used the measure that you're interested in. Usually qualitative data is not as readily available, so that can be a challenge if that's your interest. And usually when you're getting that data set, it's true. Most of the important findings have already been analyzed and reported on, and there may not be as much left for you. So it really requires some creativity on your part to find a new angle or a new research question that hasn't already been explored from the data. Okay. So that just leaves us with one more topic I want to talk about, and that's surveys. And survey, as I haven't talked about it yet it's this term people commonly use. So I want to talk about what it is, because people really talk about it in two different ways and have these two different definitions, and they'll kind of go back and forth between the two. So what are surveys? Well, one is it's a method of data collection. The other is it's a type of research. So let's keep them separate. If you're talking about a method of data collection, it's typically you're talking about questionnaires or interviews that often assess opinions, perceptions, and demographic information, right? By demographic information, we might mean things like gender and age and race and all that sort of stuff. It's also, in addition to being questionnaires or interviews, it also refers to a widely used type of non-experimental research. Okay, so when we talk about survey research, if you hear that term, what they're meaning is we talked about what experimental studies are, right? Those are the ones where you control the IV, you're looking for cause and effect, and it's a very tightly controlled study typically, right? Whereas with non-experimental research, you might not be able to manipulate the IV, and you're looking for the association between variables, and sometimes that kind of research is called survey research. Okay. So I know that was kind of a longer lecture today. Of course, you can always go back through and page through and pause. Hopefully it's helpful in giving you some idea of the different major methods of data collection. And next time we'll talk more about the other two pieces, defining and sampling. Be well, and I'll talk to you then.